So welcome back to the show. Today, we're so excited. We have Eugenie here with us, and it's kind of a unique story about how we got connected together. Recently, our team member, Heather, who's here today, had attended a training with Daniel Ansari, who's doing some tremendous work in the field of dyscalculia. And Eugenie and Heather started up a conversation in the chat, back and forth, and I'm starting to get screenshots of this conversation, and she's saying, let's get her on the podcast. This is amazing. I think this would be such a good connection. And so thankfully, Eugenie said yes. And so it's such a great opportunity to have you here because you're doing very similar work to what we're doing at Made for Math, but you're a researcher and you are the director of the academic clinic. And so I would just love to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about more who you are and how you got started in this work.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's an easy story how I got started in this work because my youngest son has got a severe manifestation of dyslexia. And so I had a varied background. I was an exercise physiologist. I worked in scientific worlds and also had done a teaching degree when I was much younger. So my husband works for an oil company and we ended up being dragged all over the world. And I suddenly realised that I couldn't just take this child to all these different schools and expect, the schools to know what to do with him. And so I needed to learn, as much as possible myself in order to be able to assist him. And it was certainly an area of interest. The reason I chose mathematics was because I had a background in mathematics. But the main reason, I guess, in the initial stages was because we were living in Malaysia and my son was attending an international school and I got some work in the support centre there. And I was just a bit concerned that if I looked at literacy, the different levels of English competency had the potential to skew that data, the results. Mm-hmm. So even though they had different units, there was a huge disparity in because obviously it was an international school, in the English competency. So I thought, well, I started to look at the mathematics and there wasn't a lot in that time. And I thought, well, this is really important as well. And I know my son has profound difficulties with number as well as with language. So maybe I'll take a look at this. And the rest is history. It led to a PhD and then, all the career things that I've done since then. And then when I came back to Australia, I started to tutor students, and it just grew. So the demand was so huge. Mm-hmm. And then a developmental paediatrician based here, I was working with one of his patients and he asked me to come in and see him. He said, we need to develop something that we can send people to that's not a commercial, is non-commercial, it's not for profit. He was an amazing guy. He mm-hmm. worked 90% of his time in public health rather than private, which was obviously to his financial detriment, but still does amazing. Yeah, still does amazing work. So he taught me into doing that, and I had a background in starting a commercial company mm-hmm. that had been successful. So, I thought, do I really want to go there again? Yeah. Because it's a tough gig, right? And it's very emotionally draining. So, but yeah, we've surrounded ourselves with really good people who've come along for the journey. So that's how it all started with my son.
I'm so glad that you went down that path. And just for those that heard that your son was struggling, how is he doing now?
Yeah, so Jordan is now 25, and he actually did well at school. He did what was called the ATAR here, which is the university entrance. But he started at university and chose not to, and now runs an import-export company to the US that he started by himself. Yeah. So it was always going to be big shot or bust for Jordan, but it was really interesting because people say to me, well, where did he get that drive? And do you know what? I think it actually got from he got that from struggling at school because he's not afraid of failure. Yeah. He had that throughout his whole schooling life and, battled to overcome it. And so now he's just, what's the worst thing that can happen? I'm going to give this a shot. So he's definitely gone down the big shot or bust pathway, but it seems to be working okay at the moment. So
I love that. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. So one of the things that really drew Heather to you was that you were one of the leaders of a review of evidence-based approaches. And I think the paper is like part of that whole thing, but it's supporting 7 to 9 students significantly behind in literacy and math. So you were part of this evidence-based paper. So can you tell us about some of the things that you saw in there and the important strategies that came out of that review?
Yeah, certainly. And just to give you a little bit of background of that, this was a national report that was commissioned by one of our national, well, that's the main one now. They're only quite new, national research funding. So all the states and territories give money to this organisation, and they commissioned Monash University, and I was part of that team. So yeah, it was what's called an umbrella review. So for those listeners who don't know what that means, and many won't, it's a review. It's a systematic review of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So what a systematic review is just a whole bunch of papers that have been looked at, have been researched, and have been assessed using a very stringent process for quality. So they've got to meet a whole bunch of quality indicators to be included in the final sample. So there's those ones, and then the meta-analysis is the same, but they take the effect sizes of those papers and they calculate an overall effect size for all of those studies. So you're getting evidence that's based on a very large number of studies. So I think our final sample was 69 systematic reviews and meta-analyses. When we dwindled it all down, we started with many more. But there were over 80,000 participants represented in those 69 studies. So it's a very, very large sample. And I guess that the evidence that comes out should be pretty much the top level that you can get, because it's been through that. All of those studies have been through that process twice, once by the original authors of the systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and then again by us as the umbrella reviewers. And obviously we didn't make up this process. It's a very well documented process that we undertook, and it's all detailed in the report. If you ever can't sleep one night, I'm sure you'll have a lot of be able to get some soporific therapy from reading that. But for those who are interested, all that obviously researchers are interested in all that information. Is there. So I guess it's important that people understand that this is sort of the top level evidence that we were looking at. And so look, and for some of your viewers and listeners, I guess it will come as no surprise some of the things that we found. And I'll just talk about the maths papers, because we did look at reading and writing as well. And our main focus obviously was on, years 7 to 9, but a lot of the papers went across years, but we had certain criteria to include. They had to have a certain percentage of students in those years to be included in the review. And so what came out very, very strongly in terms of mathematics was, if you may have heard of them before, Russell Gersten and his colleagues published in 2009 a seminal review of strategies that work for elementary school students. And we found that a lot of those principles of effective intervention also held true and were effective for older students as well. And so that was things like explicit systematic instruction. So students who don't learn well from discovery type learning, and some students do, so you've got to keep in mind that this is what we're talking about here are students that haven't learned in those. They're significantly behind, and so they haven't learned with those traditional sort of techniques and the way that mathematics went, certainly in Australia for many years, where it was a lot more discovery learning, which is great and still definitely has its place. But and if you don't have the prerequisite skills and understandings, then those experiences are not going to be meaningful for students. And so the best way to establish those skills and understandings is to teach those skills, teach those fundamental skills very explicitly and in a systematic way. So that means that you're building gradually, you know, one set of knowledge onto another set of knowledge. And so the students build up that those key understandings that are vital for the rest of their schooling. And our research showed that it's not too late to intervene, even when they get to middle school. Obviously, ideally, we would want to prevent that from happening, you know, and that was certainly another finding of our, and I think you are way more familiar with multi-tiered systems support in the US than we are in Australia. It's something quite new. And so ideally you want to prevent that from happening, from very strong tier 1 classroom instruction with screening and that sort of thing, to alleviate those and to close those gaps as early as possible. There were some other techniques or strategies that came out. Strategy instruction itself was also very effective for older students, and that's basically teaching students about what sort of problem they're dealing with, and also what's called elaboration, and that is really explicitly connecting the new knowledge to knowledge that they already have. Mm-hmm. And one thing that we know about dyscalculia, mathematical learning difficulties, and, you know, kids who struggle with math, and I'm sure that you guys know this as well, is that they don't easily generalize their knowledge from mm-hmm. one context to another. You know, and you can see this quite blatantly with sort of severe cases of dyscalculia. You might just change the type of manipulative that you're using,
yeah,
and they can't see that that's the same thing. Right. So you have to explicitly connect that.
Yeah.
So, of course, the other thing, as I'm sure is no surprises to you, was the use of mathematical modelling. And what came out as strongly effective was using the concrete, representational and abstract approach, which is where you start with concrete manipulatives or virtual manipulatives. Then you go to students using more of a 2D or a diagrammatic representation. And then finally, the final step is that the students can then reason abstractly just with the numbers. So that's always what we're getting towards. But you must also, the other thing that is a bit more subtle that didn't come out in our research but has been written about a lot, and I know that Steve Chin, whose work I've studied for many years and based my experimental protocol on, he is very much a champion. You must link the other two steps to the abstract as you go. So if you're doing concrete work, you must link that to the written representation. So it's, you know, do the math, write the math, as I say to my master's students.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that came out as very, very important as well. And that was both when we looked at papers that examined trying to improve mathematics skills overall, as well as most of the papers actually focused on a particular type of mathematics or a particular area of mathematics. And they were things like, and again, probably come as no surprise, algebra, fractions, worded problems, basic number facts. Interestingly, there weren't as many papers on that for older students, but certainly the CRA sequence was shown to be effective, and also other arithmetic skills with computation. So, and that's things such as, you know, integers and fractions and percentages, even computations involving geometry and problem solving. And they were all very similar. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, I suppose, you've got the modelling, and then if you look at the other effective or aspects of effective intervention, is then followed by guided practice, and then independent practice. Students need to get immediate and corrective feedback that's very specific, and they also need a cumulative review. And so again, you've got to follow that spiral curriculum, and that goes back to elaboration, which is connecting new knowledge with knowledge that the students already
have. Oh, I love it. And the thing that I like about it for us, I think it's very validating for Heather and I, because that's how we set up every session. And the way we set up those sessions was actually based off the work of Joyce Steves, and she did this back in the 90s. And so,
wow.
Her work didn't get as pushed out there as it could have, back then. But it's so reassuring to hear that you're finding what we're finding, that this flow for students and these kinds of materials and experiences are what helps move the student forward and close that gap. So, I'm just excited about that.
It is good. And it's good when you go to conferences and you look at research findings, and we felt the same and went, great, we're on the right track. We're definitely, but what else? Maybe there's something else. And I'm sure that, when you're dealing with students that struggle with math, the devil is often in the detail.
Yes.
So, and this is the thing I think that is something that teachers and tutors and people who are working, other practitioners who are working with students with difficulties, is that what you've got to remember is that with these large scale studies, they're very, very valuable to tell us what techniques work overall. And I think Michelle Mazzocco, who was actually the examiner, she did some fantastic work. She examined my PhD thesis, actually.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. And she was very cool. and she said, that's right. She said the thing with these big, large-scale data sets is that you can sometimes mask the individual differences.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something I think you have to keep in mind when you're working with these individual students, is it's really important to notice what's going on with that particular student, right? So the mistake that can sometimes be made with Tier 2, and certainly here in Australia, and I'm guessing it's probably the same in the US, is that they decide that students need Tier 2, and they get a Tier 2 program, and they just teach it to the students regardless of I keep say Helen Forgas, who was one of the authors on this, her mantra has always been teaching and learning are not the same thing.
Yeah.
So you can teach things using evidence-based approaches and everything that's been shown to work. And for some reason, there's no guarantee that every student is going to learn that. So that's something I think that I've always kept in mind, and it's really important to keep in mind that, yes, this should work. The research gives us a really good place to start and very good clues. And if it's not working, that's where we go back to. But we have to notice what's happening with our learner. Yes, they should be able to do, once they've got an understanding of part, whole, they should be able to have all those number combinations for addition and subtraction up to 10. They should get that very easily. Yes, well, in my experience, good luck with that.
Yes.
And we've had many, many situations where we've had to start with 5, and then we've had to go to 6. And then we've had to do 5 and 6 together. And then we've had to go to 7. And then we've had to do 6 and 7. And then 5, 6 and 7. And that's how long it's taken. And until those neural pathways are developed and we see some growth in that area, it can be very, very slow going.
Yeah.
And very frustrating for the students, the teachers and tutors, and also the parents or caregivers.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes the temptation as an educator is, well, I'm bored with this topic. The kids got to be bored with this topic. But the truth is, no, they're not. If they were, it would look very different. And so it's trying to be creative and finding ways to keep practicing and all of that. So that's definitely something we lean into at Made for Math too. We try not to move on until they've got it, because it's so important to have those basic skills down.
Absolutely. And I think you've got to be a little bit careful with that too. And we've found the same, because the other thing that is shown is that mastery programs don't really work for these students, because there are some aspects of mathematics that they're always going to have trouble with. And I think a classic example for me is what we call here the renaming of tens. So this is usually taught in about Year 4, grade 4. And, it's very useful for calculations. But, for example, it's called renaming of tens, or sometimes it's called non-standard partitioning. So, rather than thinking of, just pulling this example out, rather than thinking of 150 petitioned as 100 plus 50, you might think of that as 90 plus 60. Or perhaps more frequently, you would think of 1,500 or 15. You guys tend to say more 1,500, which I think is more helpful for petitioning, but we tend not to use that language. Look, in my experience, students have had terrible problem with that, with doing that. And I don't think it's essential, And so we've had teachers that's go, they can't do this. We've got to keep banging away at this until we get it. Well, not necessarily. You've really got to ask, again, I'm sure you know this, but you've really got to ask yourselves, is this vitally important to move forward? Right. And that, for one, I don't think it's vitally important to move forward. Yes, it's a useful skill, but if the students can petition in a standard way and they understand place value on that level, that's enough. Yes. Move on. So, and maybe at some stage in the future, suddenly it might click for them where they come up with their own. And I have seen that happen where they've suddenly come to a realization through working with them, I can do it like this. But you try and teach that to them and there's no way you can get through. But I think also the other thing, Adrianne and Heather, is that we're very lucky with mathematics. Those who are working with language difficulties, I think, are way more restricted. We have so many different options of the way that we can do math and the way that we can explore different concepts using different types of manipulatives, using diagrams, using real world examples. We can do the same thing in so many different ways that sometimes the students don't. We do want them to realise it's the same thing eventually, but it does take out the boredom factor, I think, if you're a little bit creative about doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that was something else that came out in the research too, is it's very important to use multiple representations. So that is supported. But I think also you've got to be, again, a little bit judicious about that, because making it too busy, you can cognitively overload the students and then they get nothing. So you've got to add those things very gradually.
I think that was a good point with math facts too, because a lot of times they can move on to higher levels of math, even if they don't have the math facts. So if you're stuck on composing six, you could do adding fractions and adding with sixths and still work on that composing six, but from the concept of fractions. So they're not getting held back. They're still moving on.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think as long as they understand the concept, the part, whole concept, because obviously that comes to division. And in order to, as you know, in order to understand fractions, we first need to understand division. And so as long as they understand that, and yes, I absolutely agree, they can move on. Yeah. And certainly, our research said that students can do this in conjunction with participating in class activities, although it's still vitally important that those class activities are suitable for them, because it can be very disheartening for students who are placed in a class where it's the work is outside of their zone of proximal development. It's just unreachable. Right. And so it really needs to be appropriately differentiated for them.
Absolutely. I agree. So in 2018, you published some research, and it caught my and Heather's eye because it relates so well to what we do. But you were comparing online and in-person math interventions. And I would love for you to share what you found in that, because a common complaint we hear is, well, I don't want to do online. It's just not going to be good. But I'm sure you found some other things that you would like to share about that with us.
Yeah, definitely. And it actually came about, I had started off doing with a different study in mind, which was computer-assisted instruction. But what I found is, again, we were dragging my poor child all around the world. And then when I came back to Australia, we had people, because in Western Australia is huge. When I present at conferences overseas, I show that one European country or several European countries fits into our state. So it's a very vast area that we live in.
Yes.
There's some parts of the US that are like that as well. And so, it's hard to get some teachers to go up there. And so kids in those areas are really particularly disadvantaged. So we were getting students who had no option but to access intervention online. And I wasn't sure, I was having really good, we were having really good results, improvements in language and literacy and those sort of things, but the maths was really, really mixed. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And so the conclusion or the hypothesis that I came up with was that when it didn't work was when these students lacked the real fundamentals. Right. So if you're just doing, curriculum level tutoring online, it was fine because they've got these fundamental understandings. But what happens to the kids who don't have these fundamental understandings? And so they're the ones I targeted. And so I was really interested. I didn't have an agenda of any description as to whether this would work or not. I was genuinely investigating whether we could make this happen. And so the thing that the results showed was that, yes, it was at least as effective. And the key to that was replicating as closely as possible in an online environment what we would do in a face-to-face situation, using the concrete models and that sort of stuff. And this was done, some time ago. So the technology has moved a long way in a short period of time. And so we didn't have those fantastic tools like Braining Camp, which I'm sure you know of, and National Library of Virtual Manipulatives and those sorts of things. So a lot of the stuff I made up and used sort of things that weren't really designed for that, but just, smart boards had just sort of started to become. And they had a package that had dice and, MAB blocks and all that sort of stuff. So I kind of overlaid that over my computer and used those sorts of things. But yes, certainly that was very important. So you follow the same CRA approach, I guess, linking everything, and the personal video conferencing group, they both made significant gains. And we didn't just look at, so what we targeted was really the basics, so number sense and developing a conceptual understanding and some fluency with basic number facts. So what do they mean? Why are they important? How do we use them? And we taught mental strategies. So, we know from the research that mental strategies do transfer onto worded problems and other higher order contexts better than rote learning. Mm-hmm. And we think that's because just by executing the strategies, students improve their number sense. They learn a lot about the relationships between number, and they learn to think flexibly with number. And also for kids who really struggle with those rote learning and have tried everything, suddenly they are able to do it. They have a strategy that actually enables them to work it out, and this increases their confidence tenfold. And I'm sure that was a barrier. And in fact, we measured mathematics anxiety pre and post as well, because I was also interested in that. I knew that mathematics anxiety was a blocker to mathematics performance. And so we measured that, and we found that both groups reduced their anxiety, but it was the personal video conferencing online group was the only one that reduced it significantly. So that was a surprising finding. And we also collected, which I haven't again published yet, but will do, was we also looked at student experiences, like what their experiences were. So it was a mixed method study. I've really just published the quantitative data at this stage. And we looked at student experiences, and we had terrible technical problems in those, especially it was, and yet not one of the students mentioned that. When we interviewed them afterwards, they were all very positive. They loved the online games. They loved the learning experiences that they had, the drawing. And it was very crude sort of drawing, because it wasn't at the stage where we could give remote access to games and other functions, which we can now very easily. So they had to draw this stuff from scratch. But they fed back that they actually really enjoyed that. Which was another interesting finding as well. So yes, it was certainly worthwhile. It's worthwhile giving it a go.
Absolutely. Definitely. Well, and it's comforting to hear that that's not what stuck out to the kids, the tech problems.
Yeah, and they were bad.
Yes. Yes, it was amazing during COVID to see how quickly Zoom was changing and adjusting based on the feedback since everyone was on Zoom.
Yes.
And so they made some really incredible changes for us that we had been wanting forever, but we weren't a high enough demand. So I love that those things were there. But I think a lot of parents are very quick to compare online learning with what they experienced during COVID. So I'm sure there's some caveats about online instruction. And you did mention it needs to be as close to in person as possible, but in an online environment. So what other caveats are we missing there about that?
Yeah, I think it's the relationship between the teacher or tutor and the student. So that is critical. I think it's critical in any environment, and it's probably more critical in the online environment. And, some people might say, I think cameras make, for some students that we had in the study, we were unable to use the camera because the connectivity was so poor, we had to, stop that. But I still, I worked with those students in the study for 24 sessions and 20 and some testing sessions. So it wasn't for a very long period of time, but it was a few months. And I felt very close to them, even though I'd never met them. And it was, I was quite surprised by that. And I got lovely cards and, things from those participants later saying what a difference it had made to them. And I think that relationship is critical, is very crucial. So, and I think Adrianne and Heather, a lot of that is building trust. So these kids, as I said, a lot of them are anxious. They feel stupid because it's so hard for them and it seems to be so easy for everyone else. And so I think establishing that environment and some kids actually, I've read some studies that say some kids actually feel safe online.
Yes.
Because it's not as judgmental.
Yes.
They're not surrounded by a class of, and maybe that was the difference with COVID as well, because a lot of the online was done in a classroom. Whereas when you're working one-on-one and it's private and there's that confidentiality, and if you as the tutor or teacher make it okay to make mistakes and to explain that that's very much a part of learning, and Jo Bowler and her colleagues, following on from Carol Dweck, have done some fantastic work in math mindsets. And they have some great graphics that you can actually show students that, when you make mistakes, you actually have more brain growth than when you do it the first time without making mistakes. And I found that very valuable, where you can show some definitive evidence to students, because it takes a while before they believe that.
For sure.
And I think being able also, the other thing that's very important, whether you're working online or in face-to-face, but maybe more important online, is to be able to demonstrate to students their improvements. Because obviously if you're face-to-face, you can give them a pat on the back, or, very restricted as sort of the touching that you can do, but I think a pat on the back's okay still. So and you get that sort of, and from that physical closeness, I think, with someone, and giving the those sort of non-verbal encouragement. I mean, you guys are very kindly nodding when I'm talking here, and that's giving me a lot some positive feedback that what I'm saying valuable. And so that's very, very important to do, and to also keep in mind that, especially if we've got the camera, that those non-verbal cues are also important to the students to build their confidence.
Absolutely.
And to show them, their improvements may be tiny, particularly in the early stages, but it's important that we find a way to demonstrate that. So that the students can actually see, this is where I was and now this is where I am. And sometimes that can be tricky when you're talking about tiny little increments.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that Heather and I have been working on a lot lately is math facts, and it's on our mind a lot because we've been working on writing a book to support parents who want to work on those basic skills. So I would love to hear from you. What are some things that we should be keeping in mind in consideration of teaching math facts to students with dyslexia, dyscalculia?
Yeah, so we know that that's a defining characteristic of mathematical learning difficulties. And I think, when we listen to Daniel Ansari speak, and I know Steve Chin has always said this, and some of the other researchers as well who did some seminal work in this area, that even students with language disorders, with dyslexia, will have difficulties with mathematics. 50% of them probably have, although I think Daniel suggested it might be more than that, 50% of them will have quite profound difficulties with number, and others will have the difficulties when the language surrounding the mathematics becomes more complex. But the inability to memorise or automatise, if you like, math facts is one that is particularly important. So, and is prevalent amongst students with both obviously dyscalculia but also dyslexia. And I have to say, we don't use those terms in Australia anymore, which is interesting, because when I was in the US, you guys were starting to use those dys terms more, whereas we've moved away from them. So now, so now it's referred to as a learning disorder with specific impairments in mathematics.
Yes.
So much easier.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
So, but
and
you know, I think
we see that in the neuropsych reports that students get, right? But that is a mouthful for parents to wrap
it
their
very
heads
much
around.
is. It very much is, and that came from the APA when they changed that. And the main reason they changed that, I think, was the 13. The main reason that they changed, or 2013 that they changed that, was because there was this, we're going off topic a little bit here, but there was this big discrepancy between what was a neurobiological etiology and what was an environmental etiology or cause of these difficulties. And they went, you know what, it doesn't matter. And this is, and I'll say the same to you, it doesn't matter what's impacting on dyslexia, whether it's dyslexia, dyscalculia, or some other unknown reason. If students can't learn math facts, and it was interesting because when I started my research in this area, I very much adhered to the work of Baroudi and Steve Chin and those guys at the time that emphasised the conceptual understanding, right? And there wasn't a lot of research around at the time for that. It was all very much drill and practice, basic facts, but let's just get them to learn them in whatever way we can. And I thought, I don't know if that's the best way to go. So I went out on a limb and went with this. And now surely everyone's talking about the importance of conceptual knowledge as well as procedural knowledge, that it's really important. And so the most effective way that is now supported by lots of research is to teach students mental strategies. And this is rather than rote learning. And I think that there's a definite order that you should teach them in. And again, this is a bit tricky for us because I advocate for this order, and my Master of Teaching students will say, oh, yes, but we've got to teach 3 times tables in year 3. And I'm going, yeah, but they don't really go together that well. So here's, and I'm pinching this from Steve Chin and lots of Brian Butler.
Sure.
So we start with the 2s, right? So obviously it's very important for students to understand the multiplicative and I'm assuming by basic facts you're talking about multiplication and division facts, right? Yeah. Because addition and subtraction still is slightly, but these are the ones that are really useful in higher order maths, and it's important that students can, put their finger on quite quickly. So we start with 2s because that's double, right? And students seem to be able to double quite well naturally. And that's probably because they see doubles in their environment, right? 2 arms, 2 legs, 4 wheels, on this sort of stuff. So they seem to be pretty good at doubling. So we start with doubling and we teach them that doubling is the same. And now you can be I have to tell you a story here.
Okay.
You've got to be careful that they do understand that doubling is at the same amount. So I worked with a group of students at a school and helping to coach the support teacher. And one of the girls was diagnosed with dyscalculia, very profound. She was in grade year 6 at the time. And so I'd been through this with her also one-on-one in tier 3 as well, but this was in tier 2. And I gave them this activity, and this girl could double until the cows came home. Mentally, she had just developed this ability to double into very large numbers. She could give you times 32, no problem, just through doubling. And And so I gave them this activity and I said to them, set them a task and said, you've got to teach the year 2 students, using these manipulatives that times 2 is the same as doubling. And throughout that process, I realised that this girl who could double mentally forever put down one set of, she had 7, because I gave her 7. She was quite proficient to work with at this stage. She put down another set of counters, and then to double again, she put down a 3rd set of counters. And I went, uh-oh. I'd forgotten to teach her that doubling means adding the same amount.
Yes.
Me. And I completely missed that because she was very proficient with these facts up to times 8 at this point, and yet forgot to tell. So you teach students that doubling, and the repeated addition I don't think is as important. I think that comes along naturally if you just teach them that it's adding the same amount. So we do the 2s. Obviously, you teach students the multiplicative property of 1. But again, that can be tricky for some students, particularly if they're young or very profound. So I sometimes leave that and I say, we're talking about 1 of. And when I do, a diagnostic assessment, that's often one, even with high school kids, that's answered incorrectly. 4 divided by 1 equals 1. so that's quite important too. But start with the 2s. Then naturally from the 2s, you've got the right? Because 4s is double and double again. So I've started with my 7, I double that to get 14, and then I double that. This becomes the new group. This is the new group, is the double, is the 14. So I double that again, right? And at the same time, I also teach halving. So times 2 is double. So the opposite of that is divide by 2, which is half. And that's really lovely because you can link that to other topics, for example, the clock. So a lot of students have difficulty with an analog clock. Well, you can bring it in and I actually demonstrate the halving by drawing a circle and half, we split into 2 parts, 2 equally sized parts. Half again, we split into 4 equally sized parts, and then we half each piece again, and they know that that's the pizza. Divide by 8. So that's what we do, 2 4s and 8s. And and the divide, which is the halving, which is the opposite. Then I normally do 5s and 10s because 10s are reasonably easy for students, although it's important to show that using the MAB blocks. So instead of a group of 1, we've now got groups of 10, and that is important because this adding the 0 or knocking the 0 off nonsense can cause lots of problems down the track because guess what? Ladies and gentlemen, that does not work with decimals. And it also doesn't teach you about the base 10 concept, which is based on the multiplication and division of 10s. We're getting 10 times larger. So I do 10s because if they can't have, and a lot of church students have trouble with 5s, but if they can halve, they can work out the 5s from the 10s. And you're also teaching them about the relationship between those 2 numbers, that one is half. Then I go to the 3s and I teach the 3s as double plus 1 more group. Right? So you've got 3 times 7, which is double 7, which is 14, add another group of 7. And be careful to distinguish that from the double. And so from the 3s, then they can do the divide by 3, which is the opposite. And then the 6s is double 3. So lo and behold, we now have, as well as the multiplicative property of 1, which you can teach when they're ready, and the multiplicative property of 0, which is also very difficult, particularly young children to come to terms with. And then you've just got the 7s left, right? So with all the 7s, you've actually done all of them except 7 times 7. But you can also teach the 7s, I suppose, in the part-whole method, which is 5 groups plus another 2 groups. Right? So 5s and 2s we've learnt, so we just put those together with 5 5 groups and 2 groups make 7 groups. But really, if they've mastered the other ones, which they won't have, they won't have mastered all of them. So what we're going for here is we're going for mastery rather than automaticity. And Baruti talked about this with mastery. But what you'll find is even with severe students is eventually with practice, they will automatize some facts. Some of them will just stick, but not always. That doesn't matter because they've got a strategy that they can work it out. And they also become as fast, almost as fast at deriving those facts as they do if they were automatized. Maybe it's a bit slower with some of the ones where they've got a double, but you'd be surprised at how proficient they can become. The other thing that you need to do is to apply time pressure very judiciously and when they're ready. So what is another mistake that I think that happens a lot is the application of time pressure too early. So yes, it's important to build fluency. And again, this is from we've got to do time practice. This is really important. Yes, it is important when the students are ready. If you do it too early, they will just go back to skip counting or just guessing answers. We've got one at the moment who's in our clinic, who's just been trained to guess. and trying to deactivate that is just very, very difficult because as soon as you ask, it's just any old thing comes into the brain. And so because she's been taught she's got to give the answer very quickly, doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. So you teach them that, they practice those strategies without time pressure, and then very gradually they practice with time pressure that's incremental. Yeah. So there's one great program that we use that you can actually set exactly what you want for it, and it's and I'm sure you guys have similar things, and you can gradually increase the speed.
Oh, what's the name of your program?
That program is called Maths Invaders. I'll send you the link actually. I think it's an Australian, maybe Australian. It might be an Australian company actually, Edalive, but yeah, they've got an online version now. And so, and I have to warn you, the kids typically don't like using it because it actually works their brains. They like using it at first, but when they get older, we still make them use it because it's important to maintain that acuity. And we know even for our secondary students who have gone on to curriculum level work, if they've had a problem, they still do that.
Right.
And they still do that for the first 5 minutes and practice. And we've tried with and without, even with students studying the very high level year 11 and 12 mathematics, and it makes a difference.
It does
to them.
Yeah, yes.
It makes a difference.
Yeah,
because it just keeps just keeps them sharp. Yeah. And also they learn to look for different things. So when they're looking at this, because obviously you can do addition and subtraction. And the way that I have described it to colleagues and teachers I work with, it's almost like when musicians, I don't know if either of you are musicians, I'm not, but my sister is a musician. And so they describe it as being able to see the dots. Sometimes the dots just jump out at them and it's so easy just to transfer that. And this is it. They learn to see the numbers. They look at that and go, okay, that's a subtraction, doesn't need trading. I can just go left to right. This is, they learn that number sense that's so vitally important for the lower order type activities improves. So then they've got so much more working memory space to devote to the higher order mathematical tasks. We don't want to waste that energy on the lower order stuff.
No, that's really great. And Heather and I are just bobbleheads over here because it's just confirming everything that we're seeing and experiencing. That's really good. One of the things that we've talked about as a team, and so occasionally we throw this out to our guests, we're curious if you've come across any research or done any research about the gifts or benefits of having dyscalculia. We've heard mixed reviews.
No. Look, I don't think that any of the students that I've worked with over many, many years now would describe that as a gift or a benefit, because the sad fact is that most of them have had a miserable time at school because of it. And many of them have thought for a long time that they're stupid, even though that tends to be a little bit less. I think they think secretly. It's really interesting because some early research that I read was Eugene wrote for this book was also the Miles, that were husband and wife researchers and practitioners, the Miles, and they were talking about, the labelling of students as dyslexic at the time. They said, well, it's better to be labelled as dyslexic than lazy or stupid. And so, but this is what a lot of students think. It seems to be less so for mathematics, because so many parents would come in, and I'm sure you've had this as well, and they'll say, oh, yes, I was hopeless at maths at school, as if that, it's almost a badge of honour. None of them ever said, I couldn't read.
Right.
So there was a big difference there. And so my son is dyslexic as well. And he goes, Mum, some people talk about dyslexia being a gift and this sort of stuff. Not a gift. Definitely not a gift. A gift is something that you want that's wrapped up in a pretty parcel with a ribbon on top. No gift, dyslexia. It's just a pain. It made my life very difficult.
Yes.
And it was pretty miserable for a lot of the time. And I think we talked before about he's doing pretty well now. So I think in some ways, I guess the only thing that it would be the resilience that is drawn from that. But that's if these students get help, Adrianne and Heather, from people like you and me and all the others that we work with. But the sad fact is that some students go through their entire schooling and they're with people who don't understand this. And some students will act out, unfortunately, so then it becomes a behavioural problem, and so it gets completely lost. So it's, in a nutshell, no.
Yes.
Long answer to your question.
I agree with that astute observation. Yes. I've really enjoyed our talk, and I love the work that you're doing. And so another thing I'd like to ask people is, how can we support researchers like you? Because you're making an effort to make sure you're passing this information out, right? You're trying to be connected because, ultimately it's educators that are going to be giving these interventions. And so what can we do to support people like you?
Yeah, look, and I think having this is brilliant, and as I said, I'm a practitioner researcher, although I do spend most of my time in research and teacher training and tutor training and stuff now. But I still actually work with one student myself a week, and that's not negotiable. And that, that's really to keep what I'm going to talk about now is notice, right? What you notice is important, and this is how you can support researchers. And it's important that you document that and you write about it and you share it amongst yourselves. And I think it's so great now where you've got lots of blogs and Facebook groups and this sort of stuff where teachers can share with each other. And I know that some researchers, myself and certainly the lead author on the Monash project that we did, we look at those things. So because we're interested in what's being noticed. And researchers will look for patterns. And so if this information is out there, because you guys are working, or we're working with these students day in, day out, or week in, week out, and it's the little things that we notice that might be vitally important. And if we share that with others and share it on sort of platforms that researchers can access as well, then this, if there's a pattern that emerges, then that might, warrant further investigation. Well, how is this, is this significant? How many people does that affect? What can we do about this? So I think that's how you can support it, definitely. Although I did say, give money.
Yes, money. Yes, but you're a nonprofit, so people can donate to your nonprofit, even if it's being used in your center. I mean, that's still supporting you and the research that you're doing. So I think that's really definitely important. And a consideration that we should all keep in mind for sure.
Yeah, and I think we also try to extend to equity, to be as equitable as possible. So, which is another reason why we're developing the resources hub, because not everyone, unfortunately, can afford to pay for intervention, and it's often a very long term. It's a very long term.
Yes,
right,
it is.
for some students, and so there's a cost that comes with that, and we do it as cheaply as we can. But it's important. It's expensive to do it well.
Yes.
So we have a case manager that oversees everything as well as the tutor. So in order to do, as I'm sure you have those support structures in place.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important to do that. But the resources hub, and it sounds like you guys are doing a similar thing with your book, which is great because, some people just want to know what are evidence-based ways they can help their children at home.
Yes.
And so we'll have different levels of access for our resources hub that, like your tutors can access, or parents can access, or teachers and schools can access. And obviously it'll be pitched at different, those different levels. And hopefully that will be a bit more equitable. We do have a really great 1 hour program. You might want to edit this out, but if I'm suggesting something. So we have, and it's purely voluntary, but we ask all of our tutors that work for us to donate 1 hour a week of their time. They're only allowed to donate 1 hour, that's all, because we don't want it to become exploitative, and they don't have to, not all of them do or are able to. And then we offer that time to families of people who can't afford to pay for it, and they get exactly the same service.
That's
exactly
amazing.
But it costs them. We do charge about $5, sometimes $10 a session, and that's because we found that sadly, if it's completely free, it's often not valued. So,
yes.
And we really need these students to be online or to come to the clinic regularly for us to get a result, as I'm sure you know as well. So that's just a way of having some sort of financial buy-in for the parents and carers. But yeah, that program works really well. And I worked with a student who had fetal alcohol syndrome as a baby, and I worked with her for 5 years. Yeah, she was my 1 hour student.
That's amazing.
And that was probably I reckon it was the most rewarding hour of my week.
I bet.
Definitely. Yeah.
I bet
She graduated school, and she works aged care now, she's just such a beautiful person that it'll be lovely.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I love stories like that.
Yeah.
So Eugenie, we love to do jokes. Every day at Made for Math, we end our meetings with a joke. And I asked you if you had a favorite one, and I loved it. I would love for you to share with everybody what your joke is.
It's a very old and daggy one. I think I learned it when I was in primary school, your elementary school, but it's still one that makes me chuckle. So did you hear about the constipated mathematician?
No, what happened?
He worked it out with a pencil. Yeah, toilet humor.
Toilet humor. You must be a mom of boys.
Yes, indeed. How can you tell? I think my husband's the worst.
That's awesome. Well, it's been a great chat with you. Will you tell everyone how they can get connected with you if they want to learn more?
Yeah, sure. So you can contact me on my email address, which is eugenie@aceseducation.org.au. Or you can go to our website, which is www.aceseducation.org.au. And watch this space, because the project I'm working on at the moment is actually a new website, which is going to be a resources hub. It's aligned to the Australian curriculum, but it will be, I think, adaptable for yours as well. So it's basically looking at how teachers and also tutors and even parents at home can help their students who have learning difficulties in mathematics. So it goes from tier 1 to tier 3. So what can classroom teachers do? What are the prerequisites? Here's what you're supposed to teach in the curriculum. These are the important prerequisite skills, and here's some ideas of how you can teach those in an evidence-based way.
Great.
So that should be available early next year.
Awesome. We'll link it up for everyone into our show notes. So I appreciate it.